Dressed in a soft blush dress that whispered elegance without screaming wealth, Vanessa Cole stepped through the glass doors of one of her newly acquired luxury auto dealerships, the hum of polished engines and the scent of leather meeting her like old friends. No one recognized her, not the young receptionist tapping at her keyboard with acrylic-tipped fingers, not the sharply dressed salesman leaning against a cherry-red sports car with a grin too wide to be sincere. That was exactly how Vanessa wanted it. As CEO of a luxury automotive brand that had redefined sophistication in motion, Vanessa was no stranger to boardrooms, media interviews, or keynote stages, but today, she wanted something raw truth. She had spent years building her empire, not from privilege but from grit and sleepless nights, navigating a world where being a black woman in power often meant being underestimated, questioned, or worse, overlooked. Now, success draped her name like a tailored suit, yet she never forgot the sting of being dismissed before she could speak. So, here she was, no entourage, no executive badge, just a woman walking into her own business like any other customer. She wandered the showroom deliberately, pausing to run her fingers across gleaming hoods and chrome accents, waiting to see who would notice not her title, but her presence. A few glances came her way, quick assessments of her dress, her natural curls, her skin. Some staff smiled politely and looked away. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Her heart sank, but she kept her back straight. A young couple was being lavished with attention at the far end of the room, he in tailored slacks, she in designer heels. Vanessa noticed the salesman's energy shift when he greeted them, radiating enthusiasm, like he was sure they belonged. She didn't blame him, not exactly. Bias wasn't always loud, sometimes it just lived in silence. After nearly 20 minutes, a junior associate barely older than her niece approached, her smile shy but genuine. "Hi there, I'm Kayla. Let me know if you have any questions," she offered, clearly nervous, but making the effort. Vanessa's heart lifted slightly. "Actually, I do," she replied, her voice smooth but warm. "Can you tell me about that coupe over there?" They walked together, Vanessa listening more to Kayla's heart than her sales pitch, impressed by her honesty when she didn't know an answer, and how she offered to find out instead of bluffing. Halfway through their conversation, the general manager David finally noticed Vanessa. His eyes widened, panic flickering behind professionalism. "Miss Cole. I didn't know you were coming," he stammered, face flushing. The shift in energy was instant. Salespeople who had barely glanced at her were suddenly attentive, scrambling to offer assistance. Vanessa turned to Kayla, who now looked confused and unsure. "Thank you, Kayla. You've been incredibly helpful," she said, touching the young woman's arm gently. Then she faced the rest of the team. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vanessa Cole. I own this dealership." The room froze, an awkward hush settling like dust. "Today, I came as a customer, not a CEO. I wanted to see how people are treated when they don't walk in wearing status. Because luxury isn't just about cars. It's about service, respect, and humanity." Her voice never wavered, but it carried weight, the kind built over decades of being doubted and dismissed. "Some of you didn't see me today. That's okay," she continued, scanning faces, letting the silence teach the lesson. "But Kayla did. She didn't know who I was. She just chose to treat me with care." The young woman's eyes welled up, pride and disbelief warring on her face. Vanessa smiled at her. "That's who we are. That's the standard. Not just when cameras are on or when wallets are open, but always." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Truth, when spoken plainly, didn't require volume. The general manager nodded, flustered, offering apologies she didn't need. This wasn't about shame, it was about vision. Vanessa turned back toward the car, running her hand along its polished curve, thinking about all the doors she had to push open to get here, how many times she had walked into rooms where people saw her skin before her skills. She had vowed to build something different. And now, standing in the middle of her own empire, still disguised as an everyday woman, she knew the work was far from over. But moments like this, quiet revelations, soft corrections, were part of the legacy she was writing. Not just for herself, but for every black girl told she didn't belong, for every woman who dared to lead without losing her softness, for every customer who wanted to be seen, not sold to. As she stepped outside, sunlight catching the gold trim of her sunglasses, Vanessa exhaled deeply. The visit had been unexpected for them, yes, but for her too. It reminded her why she built this empire with intention, brick by unseen brick. Not just to be seen, but to change what people saw. The moment Vanessa stepped into the luxury car dealership, she could feel it, that subtle yet unmistakable shift in the air that so often preceded disrespect masked as formality. Dressed in a smart blazer and jeans, confident and composed, she walked in not as a window shopper, but as a serious buyer, one who had spent months researching the perfect vehicle, securing financing, and preparing for a purchase she had every right to make. But her presence didn't command welcome, it triggered skepticism. Almost immediately, she was approached by Richard Grant, the dealership's manager, a man whose forced smile didn't quite reach his eyes. His posture was rigid, his tone curt, his gaze filled with the kind of dismissiveness that spoke volumes before he even opened his mouth. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his voice lacked any genuine offer of service. Before Vanessa could respond, his assumptions took control of the conversation. Without hearing her out, without asking what she was looking for, he glanced her up and down and said, "This isn't a browsing lot. We don't let just anyone hang around." The sting of the words landed like a slap, sharp, loud, humiliating. She paused, stunned, 1,000 thoughts flashing through her mind. She wasn't invisible, but she might as well have been, reduced in his eyes to a stereotype, to someone who didn't belong based solely on her appearance, her skin color, her confidence, her presence in a place he had decided she had no right to be. Richard's words weren't just offensive, they were racially charged, soaked in decades of bias, as if the very idea of a black woman being able to afford, let alone purchase, a high-end vehicle was laughable to him. His hostility was casual, well-practiced, and entirely unprovoked. Around them, sales staff glanced over but said nothing, their silence loud with complicity. Vanessa felt the weight of their stares, of the disbelief that she could possibly be a customer worthy of attention. But she stood her ground, her spine straightening not out of pride, but out of necessity. This wasn't the first time she'd been judged before she had a chance to speak, but it didn't mean it hurt any less. The humiliation hung heavy in the air, but beneath it burned a quiet fire fueled by every boardroom she'd walked into and earned her seat, every assumption she'd proven wrong, every space she'd entered and refused to shrink inside. She didn't raise her voice or return his venom. Instead, she met Richard's eyes with steady calm and said, "I'm here to buy a car. And I know exactly what I want." But the damage was already done. His sneer barely faded, his tone still thick with disbelief. He gestured half-heartedly toward the back of the lot, clearly hoping she'd leave or prove his assumption right. But Vanessa didn't flinch. She walked past him, head held high, her dignity untouched by his ignorance. What Richard didn't know, what he didn't care to know, was that Vanessa was a successful business owner, a community leader, a woman who had worked tirelessly for every milestone she had achieved. She wasn't there to prove herself to anyone, least of all to a man who had already decided who she was before hearing a single word from her. Her story, however painful in that moment, was not unique. It was a reflection of the countless ways implicit bias and outright discrimination still operated in everyday spaces, how access and acceptance were too often filtered through the lens of race, gender, and class. The encounter exposed not just Richard's prejudice, but the larger truth about how easily dignity can be denied when people forget or refuse to see each other's humanity. For Vanessa, the moment lingered long after she left the dealership, not in defeat, but in determination. She would file a complaint. She would tell her story. And she would, as she always had, turn pain into purpose. Because what happened in that showroom wasn't just about a car, it was about how people are made to feel invisible in spaces they have every right to occupy. Vanessa's story reminds us that disrespect doesn't always shout, it often whispers, dresses itself in suits and titles, and operates under the guise of policy or procedure. But it also reminds us that strength can exist in stillness, that power doesn't always look like retaliation, and that dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken by anyone's ignorance. In standing tall, in refusing to be erased, Vanessa didn't just endure the moment, she exposed it, and in doing so, illuminated a deeper truth about what it means to belong, to resist, and to walk through the fire with grace intact. Vanessa had entered the car dealership with quiet confidence, her steps measured, her questions clear, and her tone polite, simply wanting to test drive a vehicle she had researched for months, but she didn't expect the storm that followed. As she approached the counter, she was met by Richard, a senior salesman with a practiced smile that quickly soured the moment she made her request. There was a flicker in his eyes, not curiosity or professionalism, but something sharper, something skeptical. Instead of listening, he interrupted her mid-sentence, questioning whether she could afford the vehicle before she even finished asking about the model. Vanessa remained calm, her voice even, her body language open but composed. She repeated her request without raising her tone, hoping her patience would be met with respect. But instead of reason, Richard's demeanor shifted into hostility. His voice grew louder, fingers pointed inches from her face as he accused her of trespassing, of wasting his time, as though her very presence in the dealership was an offense. Around them, the room tensed, the hum of background chatter quieted, heads turned, and silence settled like a heavy fog. Yet Vanessa stood her ground. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. Behind her calm expression, her heart raced not from fear, but from the weight of 1,000 silent battles she and others like her had endured in spaces where they weren't expected, welcomed, or believed. Still, she held firm, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And that's when Richard crossed the line. With anger in his voice and disbelief in his eyes, he reached for the phone to call security, his words sharp and loud enough for everyone to hear, "We've got someone causing trouble, get her out." The accusation rang out, absurd and humiliating, framed to turn her into a threat when she had done nothing but stand and ask a question. What he didn't see, what he failed to notice, were the two on-duty police officers seated near the dealership's coffee station, witnessing the confrontation from a distance. They stood slowly, exchanging glances not of alarm, but of concern, their posture calm yet attentive as they made their way over. Richard didn't notice them until they were standing nearby, quietly asking, "Is there a problem here?" Suddenly, his bluster faltered. The certainty with which he had weaponized authority began to slip. Vanessa turned slightly toward the officers, her voice steady as she calmly explained the situation, how she had asked to test drive a car, how she had been dismissed, accused, and shouted at for no reason. She didn't need to exaggerate or defend herself, the truth spoke clearly through her restraint. The officers listened closely, their expressions unreadable, but their presence alone shifted the power in the room. For the first time, Richard seemed uncertain, stumbling through his explanations, his earlier bravado shrinking beneath the weight of scrutiny. The dealership's manager arrived shortly after, summoned by the commotion, his eyes darting between Vanessa, the officers, and his now flustered employee. Apologies followed, clumsy, belated, and wrapped in corporate polish, but Vanessa had already decided that the apology wasn't hers to accept, not yet. This moment, humiliating and painful, was not just about a car or a man with too much misplaced authority. It was about the deeply rooted assumptions that too often dictated who was seen as a customer and who was treated as a problem. It was about how calmness in the face of disrespect is mistaken for weakness, when in truth, it is a powerful, deliberate act of resistance. It was about how quickly perception can turn into persecution when bias is left unchecked. And still, Vanessa didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply walked out dignified, composed, her silence echoing louder than Richard's shouting ever could. Her strength wasn't in her reaction, but in her refusal to be broken by it. In a world where outrage often overshadows restraint, Vanessa's quiet courage became the most powerful statement of all. The officers returned to their post, saying nothing further, but their presence had altered the outcome and perhaps the perception of every onlooker who had witnessed what happened. This wasn't just a story about a salesman and a customer, it was a story about dignity, about what it means to hold your head high when someone tries to push you down, and about the subtle, everyday ways power can be abused. It was a reminder that true strength is not in who can shout the loudest, but in who can stand their ground with grace, even when falsely accused. Vanessa left without the test drive that day, but with something far more powerful, her voice intact, her composure unshaken, and the undeniable truth that respect should never have to be earned, it should be expected. The cafe fell into an uneasy hush as Richard's voice cut through the space like a blade, loud and biting, his anger spilling out in front of startled customers and uncomfortable staff, but amidst the rising tension and the humiliation he so clearly intended, Vanessa stood still, not shrinking, not snapping, simply holding herself with a calm that felt almost out of place in such a hostile moment. Her cheeks burned from the sting of public shaming, her heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained composed, her hands steady as she slowly raised her phone and began to record, not out of spite or theatrics, but as a quiet form of protection, a dignified response to a situation designed to strip her of power. Richard, perhaps expecting her to cry or storm off, hesitated for a split second, his face twitching with surprise as he realized his outburst was no longer one-sided, it was being documented, witnessed, framed in a way that took the narrative out of his control. Vanessa didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't plead for respect, she simply held her phone with one hand and her pride with the other, her silence more piercing than any counterattack. Around them, baristas paused mid-shift, customers lowered their cups, and the room felt suspended in time, caught between discomfort and awe as this young woman, so clearly wronged, chose stillness and truth over retaliation. Richard, growing more agitated, tried to escalate, raising his voice, gesturing wildly, but the more he pushed, the more his image unraveled, his authority giving way to desperation, while Vanessa remained like a mirror, calm, reflective, and quietly powerful. Her restraint spoke volumes, sending a ripple of clarity through the room. This wasn't just an argument, it was an abuse of position, a moment when character was revealed not through volume, but through control, and in that contrast, people began to see the truth of what was happening. The whispers started, Some customers discreetly pulling out their own phones, others exchanging knowing glances, while staff members who had long endured similar treatment stood a little straighter, emboldened by the example unfolding before them. Vanessa's courage wasn't loud, but it was commanding. It was the kind that forced people to re-evaluate what strength looks like, that proved dignity doesn't have to raise its voice to be heard. Inside, she was battling the tremble in her limbs and the tears pressing at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let Richard reduce her to a moment of emotional collapse. She knew this wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had been belittled in silence, every unfair confrontation that had been swept aside or forgotten, and so, she stood her ground, not to win an argument, but to hold a line, to refuse invisibility, to say through action that no one has the right to strip another person of their humanity, especially not in public and especially not unchallenged. Richard's voice eventually faltered, his tirade losing momentum as the weight of eyes on him shifted from sympathy to scrutiny, from assumed authority to shared accountability. The space he had once dominated with intimidation now felt foreign to him, unfamiliar, as if he were the outsider and Vanessa the one who owned the floor, and in many ways, she did, because what she showed that day wasn't defiance, but discipline, wasn't revenge, but resilience. When he finally turned away, muttering something unintelligible, the silence he left behind wasn't empty, it was full, charged with a new awareness, with a collective recognition that something meaningful had just occurred. Vanessa lowered her phone, exhaled slowly, and quietly walked to the counter, not with the aim of reclaiming status, but simply to finish what she had come to do: place her order, live her day, move forward on her terms. The staff, previously hesitant, now greeted her with soft smiles and subtle nods, gestures that said, "We saw. We understand. We're with you." And though she didn't need applause or validation, the simple act of being seen and respected was enough. Vanessa had held her ground, and in doing so, shifted the ground beneath everyone else, reminding them all that grace under pressure is not weakness, it is strength refined, lived, and shared in its most powerful form. The tension in the dealership hung heavy, the kind that made every glance sharper, every breath feel too loud, as Vanessa stood in the center of the commotion, calm, poised, and quiet, yet undeniably commanding. For too long, she had watched the situation escalate, the assumptions pile up, the condescension echo through the room, not because of anything she did wrong, but simply because no one imagined that someone like her, soft-spoken, elegant, and composed, could possibly be in charge. She had entered her own business earlier that morning with quiet confidence, only to be met with suspicion and veiled hostility, first from staff who failed to recognize her, and then, more disturbingly, from the customers and even the responding officers who had been called based on a misunderstanding fueled by bias. But now, as the eyes of every person in the room turned toward her, waiting for her to explain herself as though she needed to prove her place, Vanessa finally spoke, not with anger or frustration, but with a steady, unwavering voice that sliced through the chaos like still water cutting stone. "I own this dealership." In that single moment, the room fell into stunned silence, as if the very air had been knocked from their lungs. Mouths parted but said nothing. Staff members looked at one another in disbelief, their faces betraying a cocktail of shock, guilt, and realization. The officers paused, their posture shifting subtly from one of authority to one of uncertainty, and within seconds, they were on the phone, verifying her credentials through official business registrations and her state-issued identification, which bore her full name and title as the sole proprietor of the dealership. Each confirmation that came back over the radio was like a quiet drumbeat of justice, steady, undeniable, and deeply humbling. And all the while, Vanessa stood tall, embodying a dignity that refused to be shaken, even by the weight of their assumptions. What made the moment so powerful wasn't just the revelation itself, but the emotional journey etched into it, the years of hard work she had poured into building this business from the ground up, the sacrifices she made, the times she had been dismissed or underestimated, and yet, still rose every morning determined to create something of her own. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was unshakable, forged in the fire of resilience. To witness her declare ownership wasn't just to watch someone assert their rights, it was to see someone reclaim space in a room that had tried to push them out. The moment was deeply relatable to anyone who had ever been doubted, overlooked, or made to feel like they didn't belong in the very place they had built. The emotional resonance echoed through the room, not only for Vanessa but for everyone present who now had to confront the consequences of their assumptions. Staff who had greeted her coldly suddenly remembered overlooked memos and company-wide emails bearing her signature. The customer who had questioned her right to be behind the counter now stood frozen, his earlier complaints seeming petty and absurd in the light of truth. Even the officers, professional yet visibly uneasy, offered apologies that felt too small for the weight of the moment. But Vanessa didn't demand apologies, she didn't need to. Her truth spoke louder than any sorry ever could. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice, didn't seek to shame anyone. Instead, she offered the kind of grace that only those who have endured understand, the kind that holds people accountable without diminishing her own light. Her quiet strength became the center of the room, shifting the energy from confrontation to contemplation, from judgment to growth. The story of the big reveal wasn't just about a woman proving her ownership, it was about the quiet revolution that happens when people like Vanessa stop explaining themselves and start standing in their truth. It was a reminder that leadership doesn't always come dressed in the expectations of others. Sometimes it looks like a woman calmly stating a fact that forces the world to adjust. The emotional impact of the scene reached beyond the dealership walls, speaking to the broader narrative of equality, of breaking stereotypes, and of dismantling unconscious bias. Vanessa's story became a lesson not just for those who were there that day, but for everyone who would later hear it. It reminded us that appearances deceive, assumptions limit, and that real power doesn't always need to raise its voice to be heard. As the final confirmation of her identity was acknowledged aloud by the officers, a quiet murmur of realization moved through the room like a tide. Vanessa didn't move. She didn't need to. She had already won not just the moment, but the long, uphill battle to be seen, to be recognized, and to be respected. In that silent, breathless space after the truth was spoken, she stood in the full light of her truth, and for the first time that day, the room finally saw her. The moment Richard realized he had crossed a line, the color drained from his face, his trademark confidence crumbling into a mixture of disbelief and panic that played across his usually composed features like cracks in a polished mask. For years, he had walked through the company halls with unchecked authority, his sharp tongue and subtle intimidation tactics earning him obedience masked as respect, but today, that illusion was unraveling fast. Vanessa stood across from him, her expression calm but unflinching, no longer willing to accept the veiled threats and manipulations that had once silenced others. Just moments earlier, he had said something he couldn't take back, a comment so revealing in its cruelty, arrogance, and impropriety that even he understood, mid-sentence, that this time he had gone too far. He stammered, trying to spin his words into something less offensive, something he could defend or dismiss with corporate jargon, but the weight of his history, and the silence in the room, told him there would be no easy escape. Vanessa, steady as ever, didn't raise her voice or let emotion take over. Instead, she simply reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and, with deliberate calm, pressed a few buttons before placing the call on speaker. The entire office seemed to hold its breath as the dial tone rang, sharp and cold in the air, and then clicked to life with a voice from Human Resources, "This is Carla." Without hesitation, Vanessa spoke, her tone measured and clear. "Carla, this is Vanessa Chen. I'm calling to formally terminate Richard Collins effective immediately." A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by Carla's brief pause and then her composed reply, "Understood." Proceeding with the deactivation of credentials and notifying legal. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. He looked around, desperate for a lifeline, for someone to question her authority, but no one moved. Those who once nodded along to his condescension now looked down or away, unwilling to be pulled into his unraveling. For so long, Richard had operated from a place of untouchable power, his charm in boardrooms and cutthroat tactics behind closed doors making him seem invincible. But what he had failed to realize, or refused to see, was the quiet accumulation of resentment, the whispered conversations about his behavior, the emails saved, the eyes that had slowly started to open. Vanessa, who had endured more than most, had finally had enough, and she wasn't alone anymore. She didn't need to justify herself, she had the facts, the witnesses, the support, and, more than that, the moral ground he had so carelessly abandoned. Richard tried again, his voice cracking, "Vanessa, this isn't look, let's talk about this," but she cut him off gently, not with anger, but with finality. "You've had years to talk, Richard. Years to listen. And you chose not to. Actions have consequences, even for you." The HR director's voice returned, confirming that Richard's accounts were already locked, that security would escort him from the building, and that all communications would now be directed through legal. Richard blinked rapidly, as if trying to wake from a bad dream, but this was real and it was public. Every inch of the office, from the glass walls to the still figures of employees frozen in their places, bore witness to the collapse of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. There was no dramatic outburst, no fiery defense, just a hollow kind of silence as he gathered his things, his hands shaking slightly, the gravity of the moment finally sinking in. Vanessa remained still, not triumphant, but composed, carrying the weight of justice with dignity. Her decision hadn't come from vengeance, it had come from necessity, from the need to protect her team, her values, and the integrity of the workplace they all deserved. As Richard was quietly led away, a shift occurred not just in management, but in morale. People exhaled, slowly, realizing they had witnessed something bigger than just a firing, they had witnessed accountability, something long overdue. Eyes met across desks with silent nods of solidarity, and a sense of calm purpose began to fill the space where fear and discomfort had once lived. Vanessa tucked her phone away, straightened her shoulders, and turned back to her team, not as someone who had taken power, but as someone who had reclaimed respect. In that moment, the culture of the company changed, not with a memo or a policy update, but with a single, courageous act that told everyone watching, dignity matters, silence has limits, and no one, no matter how high they sit, is above consequence. The room fell into an icy silence as Richard stood frozen, his usually commanding voice reduced to a series of awkward stammers, the polished confidence he was known for unraveling in real time. Moments earlier, his arrogance had filled the space, dismissive remarks, a condescending tone, and yet another decision made from a place of unchecked entitlement rather than leadership. But this time, he had gone too far. Vanessa, calm but resolute, sat across the table, her eyes sharp and unwavering, the weight of the moment pressing down like a quiet storm. She had been silent for long enough through the subtle undermining, the backdoor deals, the way Richard manipulated systems to protect himself while others paid the price. But today, everything changed. The air felt thick as Richard tried to recover, realizing the weight of what he'd just said, the impact of the mistake he could no longer bury. He attempted to reframe his words, to paint his intentions as misunderstood, but the truth stood naked in the space between them, undeniable and irreversible. Vanessa didn't yell. She didn't flinch. Instead, with a composed certainty that silenced even the whispers in the room, she reached for her phone, unlocked it, and placed it face up on the glossy conference table. Her thumb hovered for only a second before pressing the contact labeled Regional Director, HR. She hit speaker. The room collectively held its breath. As the ringing echoed through the space, Richard's complexion paled, the color draining from his face as his title, once his shield, began to feel more like a paper crown. When the call connected, Vanessa didn't hesitate. Her voice was measured, professional, but firm with authority. "This is Vanessa Liu, Senior Compliance Officer. I'm with Richard Harlan in Conference Room B. Please consider this an official directive. Effective immediately, Mr. Harlan is to be terminated from his position for ethical misconduct and policy violations. Please proceed with revoking his access credentials and initiating the offboarding process." There was a pause long enough for Richard's mouth to open slightly in disbelief, but not long enough for him to interrupt. On the other end of the line, the regional HR director acknowledged the request and began executing the protocol. The quiet click of keys and confirmation codes through the speakerphone felt like a countdown clock, each beep echoing like a nail in the coffin of Richard's crumbling career. He reached out in protest, still trying to salvage control, his words a mixture of desperation and denial. "Vanessa, let's talk about this. This is a misunderstanding, a mistake. We can work this out." But Vanessa remained still, her gaze unwavering. "What's happening now is accountability," she replied, her voice low and even, "something this company has needed for a long time." Around the room, others who had once kept their heads down now looked up. There was no chaos, no yelling, just a quiet, collective realization that the power dynamics had finally shifted. Those who had been silenced by fear or worn down by Richard's manipulations now saw a leader willing to draw a clear line, a leader who understood that silence in the face of misconduct was no longer an option. Richard, who had once ruled through intimidation, now stood exposed, the myth of his invincibility shattered not by scandal or scandalous headlines, but by a woman who had simply chosen not to let injustice continue on her watch. The HR director confirmed Richard's termination and notified security to escort him from the premises. No one cheered, but the emotional undercurrent in the room was undeniable: relief, vindication, and a kind of quiet gratitude that someone had finally said enough. Vanessa ended the call, stood up slowly, and addressed the room not with gloating, but with clarity. "Let this serve as a reminder," she said, "that leadership is a responsibility, not a privilege. Power without integrity will always collapse. It may take time, but eventually, the truth finds its voice." She gathered her notes, nodded respectfully to the stunned faces around the table, and left the room, leaving behind a silence not of fear, but of transformation. Richard, still standing by his chair, looked around for anyone to come to his defense, but found only a mirror of the silence he had imposed on others for years. As he was quietly escorted out, he carried not just the loss of his position, but the weight of his choices. Meanwhile, outside that room, a quiet shift had begun, one that would ripple through departments, teams, and conversations, reminding everyone that justice, when rooted in courage and carried out with calm conviction, doesn't need to shout to be heard. And in the days that followed, the story of Richard's fall became more than office gossip. It became a turning point, a lesson etched into the company's culture, showing that true strength lies not in titles, but in integrity, and that sometimes, all it takes to bring change is one person brave enough to speak with truth and act without fear. As the crowd began to disperse, their murmurs still echoing with the weight of everything that had unfolded, Vanessa stepped forward not just as a colleague, or a bystander, but as a voice for countless others who had felt invisible in the very spaces they helped build. With calm strength and unshakable grace, she addressed the remaining onlookers, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that turns heads and opens hearts. Her words weren't rehearsed or polished for effect, they were raw, real, and deeply rooted in lived experience. Vanessa spoke not only for herself, but for every person who had ever been judged before being heard, overlooked because of how they looked, where they came from, or how they spoke. She reminded the crowd that respect is not something that should be earned through appearances or titles, it is something owed to every human being by default. Her message was simple, yet profound: no one should ever be diminished, dismissed, or disrespected based on prejudice. In that moment, Vanessa did more than speak. She held a mirror up to the room, asking everyone present, whether they realized it or not, to examine their own assumptions and biases. She didn't accuse, she invited reflection. She didn't scold, she inspired accountability. Her tone carried the ache of someone who had endured subtle slights and silent battles for far too long, but also the hope of someone who believed change was not only possible but necessary. Vanessa spoke about diversity not as a corporate buzzword or a box to check, but as a living, breathing reality that makes workplaces richer, smarter, and more humane. She talked about the quiet power of inclusion, about the strength found in different perspectives, and how innovation and empathy walk hand in hand when every voice is heard and valued. As she stood there, she represented all those who had once swallowed their voices for fear of being labeled too emotional, too sensitive, too angry, or too different. Her presence itself was a form of resistance, a refusal to shrink in the face of discomfort, and a bold declaration that dignity has no dress code, and fairness has no favorites. Vanessa's speech was not long, but it didn't need to be. Every sentence landed like a soft echo in the chest, resonating with anyone who had ever seen someone underestimated, or been underestimated themselves. She acknowledged that change wouldn't happen overnight, that policies and training can only go so far without honest human effort, but she also believed that moments like this could become turning points. Her words stitched threads of hope into the fabric of the room, weaving a vision of a workplace where judgment is replaced by curiosity, where assumptions give way to understanding, and where every person, no matter their background, accent, hairstyle, or skin tone, feels seen, heard, and respected. It was a message for the executives who had looked the other way, for the employees who had stayed silent out of fear, and for the bystanders who now felt something stirring in their conscience. And perhaps most importantly, it was a message for the younger employees watching from the sidelines, those still learning how to navigate professionalism while carrying identities that the world doesn't always treat fairly. Vanessa gave them something more than inspiration, she gave them permission to be themselves, to speak up, and to demand better, not just for themselves, but for those who come after. In that quiet corner of the room, as her voice gently faded, something had shifted. No applause erupted, but eyes met differently. Conversations lingered. A sense of reflection hung in the air, like a pause before a new beginning. Vanessa hadn't just addressed a crowd, she had planted a seed, one that would take root in uncomfortable truths and, with care, blossom into lasting change. Her message wasn't for a select few, it was for everyone watching, those in power and those still finding their footing, those who thought they understood and those realizing how much they had overlooked. It was a reminder that workplaces are not just built with policies, but with people, and people thrive when they feel respected, safe, and valued. Vanessa walked away not as the hero of the story, but as its heartbeat, a steady, unwavering pulse of what leadership truly looks like when it is fueled by empathy, courage, and an unshakable belief in equality. And as the doors closed behind her, the silence she left behind wasn't empty, it was full of possibility. Vanessa had spent years building her reputation not just as a successful CEO, but as a woman of integrity, vision, and quiet resilience. She wasn't loud, and she didn't need to be, her presence alone carried weight. So, when the day came that she was publicly challenged, wrongly accused, unfairly questioned, and subtly undermined in her own dealership, it felt less like a confrontation and more like a defining moment in the long arc of her journey. The incident began with whispers, then escalated into a misunderstanding fueled by bias, until eventually police were called not to protect her, but to interrogate her. Cameras flashed. Witnesses stood silent. Some looked on in confusion, others in disbelief, but Vanessa stood tall, steady, and unshaken. She didn't plead or argue. She didn't shout to prove her authority. Instead, she spoke calmly, clearly, and with a dignity that silenced even the most skeptical onlooker. In those tense minutes, every breath she took was a reminder that power doesn't always roar, sometimes it walks, slowly and deliberately, with its head held high. As she gathered her things and stepped out of the dealership, she left behind more than an office. She left behind a message. That strength is not measured by how loudly you speak but by how deeply you know who you are. That injustice, no matter how public, does not get to define you. And that when systems fail to recognize your worth, you do not shrink to fit their expectations, you rise above them. The officers, though professional, felt the weight of the moment. They knew something had gone wrong. The staff, who had once seen her as just a woman in charge, now saw her as something more, a symbol of grace under fire, someone who could be humiliated publicly yet refused to be broken privately. Outside, journalists scrambled to interpret the scene, but the image that would stay in everyone's mind was simple: Vanessa walking out, head high, her silence louder than any protest. What the world didn't know was how many times she had prepared for this, how many boardrooms she had walked into under scrutiny, how many times she had been doubted, interrupted, talked over. This moment wasn't new to her, it was just more visible. But even in the spotlight, she never betrayed who she was. Her calm wasn't weakness, it was wisdom earned from years of knowing that grace is not submission, it's strategy. That day became more than a headline, it became a lesson. Young women of color saw her and knew they didn't have to shout to be heard, they could carry themselves with the same quiet fire. Executives began asking questions about how leadership really looks, and what kind of environments allow bias to fester unchecked. Conversations started not because Vanessa demanded them, but because her very presence had made them impossible to ignore. She didn't give interviews, didn't go on a press tour, didn't turn the moment into a personal platform. Instead, she focused on what mattered, transforming pain into purpose, mentoring others, and holding doors open wider than they were for her. Vanessa continued her journey elsewhere, unburdened by the building she had left behind, but deeply proud of the legacy she had laid within its walls. Her departure wasn't an end, it was a continuation of a path she had always been walking, one defined by integrity, courage, and a refusal to be defined by anyone else's narrative. In every space she entered afterward, her story followed her not as a tale of defeat, but as an anthem of unshakable dignity. And while many may have forgotten the specifics of that day, the headlines, the footage, the awkward apologies, no one forgot how she walked out, back straight, eyes forward, voice steady, never once raising her voice, but raising the standard for what true leadership looks like. Vanessa reminded the world that sometimes, The most powerful thing you can do in the face of injustice is to walk away without bowing your head, because grace under pressure isn't weakness, it's the quiet revolution that changes everything.